It was good to see John Kennedy this morning and to remember him as he was those years ago. I knew him. I was a campaign manager for John Kennedy for the New York City area when he ran for the presidency. I worked closely with Bobby and John and the group around them. And I was running for the New York State Legislature at the same time, and we both were elected, he as President of the United States. And it's good to remember him now, because with all the confusion that's been created, all the mischief done by official investigations, by lawyers and doctors who have betrayed their commitment and their oath, it becomes clear that for the rest of us, we just have to understand that if they kill our president, we're supposed to do something about it. And that's why we're here. Voltaire said it. He said, "If we believe absurdities, we shall commit atrocities." And that summarizes well, I think, why we were here, why we are here, and why we've been here all of these years, all of us, so many people, working so that the truth can be known. We're here 40 years after the murder of an American president, still trying to get the record straight, knowing that nothing is settled until it is settled properly. We are here seeking to undo the mischief created by those who determined to issue and support a knowingly false report, an absurd report, an official document which shielded the murderers of the president. Remember, when you hear all the law and order talk these days, how important it is to strike down on criminals. Your government made the decision not to prosecute those who killed the President of the United States, to shield him with a bizarre report. We are here to mitigate the damage done to our nation and its principles by small and ambitious men who established a dangerous precedent that imperiled the rule of law. And we are here in the hope that we may prevent future and further atrocities. I'm grateful to Cyril Wecht, an old and dear friend, for conceiving and organizing this most impressive symposium with the Duquesne School of Law and Cyril's Institute of Forensic Science and Law. I note that from the brochure that the Pennsylvania Continuing Education Board has approved this program for 14 hours of substantive law and for practice and procedure, but 0 hours for ethics. I trust that the presence of a Warren Commission lawyer among our numbers was not the condition precedent for the ethics exemption. I actually hesitated when I was asked to speak here today. After all, the world continues to be round, just as it was 40 years ago, and neither newly discovered evidence nor CIA-influenced media representatives with yet another obsequious defense potentiously described as a new evaluation can alter that fact. The few remaining members of the Flat Earth Society will remain unconvinced, while the rest of us, now comprising, according to the Gallup poll of yesterday, published yesterday, the survey taken this month, now comprise 75% of the American people, as we have for a very long time, since 1966. And it was not an offhand remark that Dr. Baden made yesterday, saying that we believe in large numbers there was a conspiracy because of the movie JFK. It was an insult to the intelligence of every American. Because movies influence us. The same number of people, of Americans, doubted the Warren Report before the Oliver Stone movie of 1991, doubted it for 25 years, as did after that film came out. We are not children. Our knowledge does not come to us exclusively through fiction films. I wrote my first book, Rush to Judgment. No one would publish it in this country. Everyone agreed to publish it, and then after 3 weeks, a note would come back saying, sorry, we can't publish it. Now, under the Freedom of Information Act, we get the documents. The FBI and the CIA went to each publisher and said, don't publish that book. That's why it wasn't published. The excuse they gave to me was they didn't think it would sell enough copies to break even. I said, well, how many is that? They said, 5,000. I said, I'll buy the first 5,000. Now you're at the break-even point. What I didn't know and barely even suspected was the American intelligence organizations had decided to prevent the book from being published. It's a personal problem for me, but more than that, it was a problem with the whole concept of a continuing First Amendment in this nation regarding a very important event, and an effort to shield the commission from any criticism. You don't recall this probably because it doesn't seem possible now. For more than 1 year after those shots were fired, not one word of dissent, not one word of question was permitted on a single radio or television network show. Not one word. The major newspapers lined up. The New York Times, the Washington Post, they all lined up behind it. And no dissent was permitted. The only way I could reach people in more than one city was to go to Canada, and CBC would come into Buffalo and Detroit and other border towns. In America, that's how the First Amendment was produced by those who wanted it to be kept secret. The one who amused me the most, I suppose, was Allen Dulles, who was a member of the Warren Commission. He gained that position, of course, because he had been fired by John Kennedy for lying to him and to the American people about the Bay of Pigs invasion, and therefore they felt that he would be a good person to serve on the commission to tell us all the truth about the death of President Kennedy. But at a top secret conference now made available in the archives, Dulles was talking to his colleagues who were a little bit nervous about signing a knowingly false report. And he said, don't worry about it. No one will read it. No one will understand it. Oh yes, maybe some college professor somewhere will read it and write a little thesis, but no one will read it besides that, and it will soon be forgotten. Too bad he's not here with us today, 40 years later, discussing the ongoing problems that he and his colleagues have created. It hasn't been forgotten, and more than one college professor has read the report. When Rush to Judgment could not be published here, I found an old conservative publishing house in London, the Bodley Head, 100 years old, and they agreed to publish it. They had a different system from the one we have here. They didn't turn it over to MI-15 and say, should we publish it? They sent it to Professor U. Trevor Roper, the Regents Professor of Modern History at Oxford, to get his view. And he said, it's a great classic, publish it. I'd be honored if I could do the introduction. At the same time, they received a copy of Gerald Ford's book, Portrait of the Assassin, and they decided they had to do one or the other. They said that was the easiest decision they had to make because they didn't think publishing the children's version of the Warren Report would be of any value. After my book was accepted there, Holt Reinhardt and Winston in the United States called and said, we want to publish your book. I said, great. I went to meet Arthur Cohn, editor-in-chief, and he said, we're going to publish your book. I said, fine. And he said, you don't seem excited. I said, this is the 16th American publisher, Arthur, that's told me that my book's going to be published. and I hope you do it, but I'm not really confident. And he said, well, listen, I'll give you my word of this. Some power could stop us, of course. If that's what happens, I will resign as editor-in-chief, and I will take with me every editor, and we will publicly say why we're doing this. Well, the time came. Deke DeLoach ran the New York office for the FBI and went to meet with the leadership of Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, and said, John, that was J. Herbert Hoover, the Bureau, that was the FBI, and me, that was Deke DeLoach, don't want this book published. And every publisher, it's the nature of business, has involved tax matters, and I don't think you want to get involved in having this book published. Well, they took that back to the president of the company. Arthur Cohn said, what should we do? The president said, what do you think we should do? And Arthur said, I think there has to be a response. We should double the advertising promotion for the book and double the run of the book, or close down the publishing house. If we reach the point in America where publishers are told by the secret police what they can publish, we should not be in publishing. They published the book. It sold over 5,000 copies the first 2 hours it was on sale. It became the #1 best-selling book in America. It was on the New York Times list for about a year, until it came out in paperback, and then it sold millions of copies and was the #1 best-selling paperback book in America. And I suspect that all the publishers who turned it down had an idea that that might possibly happen, and they were willing to give up their profit here in our capitalist society if the intelligence organizations told them it would be best to do that. The book came out. First poll showed 70% of the American people, back in '66, with almost nothing else available. 66% of the American people said they did not believe that Oswald did it alone. No, they didn't get it in a film. By then, discussions were taking place. Experts who were not bought and paid for by the government, like Cyril, came forward, and more information was made available, and it reached the point where 3/4 of us now say we don't believe the Warren report. This another startling piece of information in yesterday's poll, and that is that 34% of the American people believe the CIA killed President Kennedy. That's an agency of our government which is still operating, still killing people. And 34% of people say they did it. And 19% of the people believe the Warren report. Almost twice as many Americans believe the CIA killed their president than believe the official story that Oswald didn't acting alone. So we've come a long way, and we still have a way to go. I'm not one of those who thinks it's possible to convince the government to change its mind to tell the truth. Others have. French government in the Dreyfus case did tell the truth finally. A great deal took place before that, but not as much as has taken place here. I don't know. I wrote the legislation which set up the House Select Committee on Assassinations, set up an office in Washington, and I lobbied member after member after member in an effort to get them to sign. And I remember that effort very well, and I went into that with some hope, and then we ended up with a House committee which had become political, and the fine work that it was doing with Dick Sprague and Bob Tannenbaum moving forward was stopped. And it was stopped by the utilization of the government, of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and cruel and vicious attacks on Dick Sprague, and to the point where the chairwoman of the Black Caucus, a woman I knew well, Yvonne Braith, called me and said, we're not going to get the funding unless these men are removed. And I said, well, and she said, I'm calling you, I just want your support on this, because no one feels more strongly about this in America. We can't get the funding if Sprague is still going to be the director with his staff. And I said, well, What will happen if you fire him? Who will you bring in, and what will you be allowed to do? Go down in flames publicly. That's a service. Say, the government, the FBI, the CIA will not allow us to continue, will not allow us to investigate. And this raises very serious questions about their involvement in the crime, and certainly in the cover-up of the crime. Well, they were members of Congress. They didn't do that. And that was the end of the investigation. And Mr. Blakely came in and closed it all down. Remember in those days what we were told about the report. Walter Cronkite, this is a report, remember, it has been repudiated by the president who appointed it. Lyndon Johnson, when interviewed by Walter Cronkite sometime later when Johnson's book came out, was asked about the report, and of course Walter was sure what the answer was going to be, and the answer was, you know, Walter, I never believed that report. I always thought there was a conspiracy. That's the president. When they talk about the president's commission on the assassination of President Kennedy, that's the president. He didn't believe it. Then, of course, we have the unanimous conclusion of the House Select Committee that there was a conspiracy to kill President Kennedy. Means they didn't believe it. And then we had a trial, a defamation case in the United States District Court brought by Howard Hunt against a newspaper that said that Mr. Hunt and his colleagues in the CIA were involved in the assassination. I tried that case, and I started by saying to the jurors, I'm going to present evidence to you to show you the involvement of the Central Intelligence Agency in the assassination. The jury's eyes rolled. Like, oh, are you serious? And that they could not take that statement seriously. We had a case, we had eyewitnesses. It was a hotly contested case. It was a very fair judge who allowed evidence in. He decided what was relevant. They decided what was true. The jury came out and unanimously found for us, and the forewoman of the juror said to the assembled news media, before this trial began, I believed mom apple pie in the American way, and now it says mom and apple pie. And we are all convinced the CIA killed President Kennedy. We have heard evidence that other people have not heard, and we've heard it in a court of law. That's our unanimous position. I know you read that in the New York Times and the Washington Post, right? Not a word. Not a word. So we have a ruling by a jury. We have a statement by the President of the United States. We have the committee of the Congress all saying the report's wrong, there was a conspiracy, and still for some reason the debate continues. Too many people, too much involved. This is where the debate began. Walter Cronkite in his 4 one-hour programs presenting the Warren Commission's view said to us, this is a quote, "We must have faith in the Warren Commission." Faith. Said it a couple of times. He also, when they talked about single bullet theory and things of that nature, he said, under ordinary circumstances, it couldn't have been done that way. And then with his voice and sincerity, he said, but this is not a joke, this is a quote, that this was not an ordinary circumstance. They were shooting at the President of the United States, thereby changing the law of physics that day. We must have faith, he said. But the report, and I suppose that's the best way to believe it, other than by not reading it, but it was not inscribed on tablets. It was not handed down at a mountaintop. Our tradition teaches us that in a democracy, the faith we must have is in ourselves, in our own ability to read, to study, to reason, to think, and to reach conclusions. That's the faith we must have as we go forward in a democratic society. Not in the words of Walter Cronkite or this political organization which was set up by the president, but in ourselves. The commission itself was set up in a fashion which traduced our concept of law. Just the appointment of the commission to start out with. It compromised the sanctity of the separation of powers. The chief executive appointed an executive committee by executive order. That's one branch. It was represented by the judiciary, the chief justice, working for the president. That was another branch. And the majority of the members of the committee were members of the Congress, of the Senate and the House. All branches of government were brought together. Thus, any meaningful judicial review of the misconduct of the Warren Commission had been effectively precluded, as had any timely review by either chamber of Congress. They were all in on it, and they're not supposed to all be in on it. That's why we have separate branches of government. But they were not checks on each other. They were comrades with each other. And of course, to ensure that the search for the truth would not be tainted by any bias, they added Allen Dulles to the mix. Never mind that he had been fired for lying to the president. The General Counsel of the Commission announced that's J. Lee Rankin, before the Commission took a single word of testimony in the New York Times, prominent story in January of '64, that the objective of the inquiry was to reassure this country and the world that not only that we can protect the president, I don't know how they're going to do that, but that the accused criminal can be fairly treated. Well, since the president had been murdered in broad daylight while being surrounded by Secret Service agents, and the accused, not the accused criminal, but the accused had been murdered by a friend of the Dallas Police Department while in the custody of that department, and live on television, those lofty aspirations seemed likely to fail. The Commission did its work, all of its work, in the shadows of secrecy. The major news media acquiesced in the darkness. The hordes that you see in front of Michael Jackson's place, in O.J. Simpson's place, in all of the major crimes, the hordes of reporters, where were they? Why did the New York Times not once say if Oswald had lived, he would have been entitled to a public trial? You're trying him after his death. Why? This is the most important murder in our history. Why can't we see what's happening? Every word taken was marked top secret. They worked in absolute secrecy to their shame and to the degradation of the media, all of the media. Not one representative of a media outlet in America said, there's something wrong with this. The ACLU didn't bring its usual actions to get in there. But if there's a sordid little rape case someplace, and they're trying to hide the name of the little girl, the press wants to know what her name is. They have, under the right of the First Amendment, to get all of the information. But how about the investigation into the death of our president? Where was that curiosity? It was fear. It was fear and a willingness to go along with whatever the government was going to say. New York Times, they published the one-volume Warren report. And Anthony Lewis, writing for the New York Times, said, and what was the one-volume report? It was supposed to be based upon 26 volumes of evidence, which was still secret. Times didn't wait for the evidence to come out. Front page of the New York Times, Warren Commission report proves now and forever Oswald did it alone. It was merely a summary of evidence, and they weren't allowed to see the evidence at that time. And so it was with me, with the news media. Total, absolute, undying support. Among the other things that the Warren Commission did was to deny the deceased the right to counsel. Oswald's mother asked that I be allowed to represent Oswald's interests. They agreed, and when I went there, they said, no, you can come as a witness, but you cannot come as counsel, meaning there could be no cross-examination of anything that was said by any witness. Let me tell you this, I've been trying cases for 52 years, still doing it now. That's about a quarter of the century, quarter of the history of the American judicial system. I've tried an awful lot of cases, a lot of murder cases, and it is well known among trial lawyers that cross-examination is the engine that fuels the concept of due process. Almost everybody's okay on direct examination. It's on cross-examination when some of the information comes out. I think we saw Dr. Baden give an excellent explanation of how that worked yesterday after he spoke, and then when he was answering questions. That wasn't exactly cross-examination, but there were a few reasonable questions asked of him, and I think you can see the difference. They didn't want the cross-examination, and so they worked in absolute secrecy. Murder could not have been more public. The investigation could not have been more secret. So a secret tribunal then altered and suppressed evidence. Conclusions were offered which were rejected by the facts which resided in the volumes which were not even then available to us. Documents were buried for years. Cruel and coordinated personal attacks by the government, including the FBI, the CIA, and the Warren Commission itself, were made upon those who dared to pose questions. A number of us in this room are aware of how vicious those attacks were, and not for any suspected criminal conduct. It was for raising questions about the death of our president. Critics of the report were placed under surveillance by the intelligence agencies and defamed by the agencies. The Commission was aware of those actions since I brought them to the attention of Earl Warren when I testified twice before the Warren Commission. I told him of what was taking place, and he approved of that vast, outrageous misconduct by the intelligence organizations against a small handful of people who were acting as the only patriots in this picture at that time. And through it all, there was an obedient media that was denied the evidence by the government, by governmental edict. They were embedded in the cover-up. They were busied themselves writing panegyrical reports in lieu of serious analysis. And together they established a troubling legacy that remains with us today, a precedent that imperils our self-evaluation of our nation as a free and open society in which the facts are readily available and debate and public issue is permitted, public issue is not only permitted but encouraged. In short, what is the impact of the precedent established by the Earl Warren and his entourage and associates and his willing lawyers and the subservient media? Did that effect have any impact upon the war against our Constitution being conducted now by Ashcroft, or upon the war against Iraq, a war opposed by the largest demonstrations in the history of this planet? Those who ignore the troubling past may find that it does influence the present. 3.5 decades, a critic of the Warren Commission wrote these words: "There is no natural law that rights wrongs. The rule of law rests upon those who affect to admire it. As long as we rely for information upon men blinded by the fear of what they might see, the precedent of the Warren Commission report will continue to imperil the life of the law and dishonor those who wrote it little more than those who praise it." Modesty prohibits me from revealing the name of that prescient author. How has the Warren Report impacted so adversely upon the rule of law in our nation? See the law as a river, tranquil, reassuring, moving with deliberate speed in precedented and predictable paths. That is the law at its best. Yet at other times, often in moments of national peril, when the universal application of our principles is most severely tested and most urgently required. The keepers of the holy law, infused with passion, fear, greed, ambition, and sophistry, transform that river into a treacherous force that destroys all before it and leaves behind a ravaged, hostile, unfamiliar landscape that challenges us to sort it out and begin again to rebuild our injured and imperfect democracy. Of course, the Warren Report does not stand as a stain upon our blemished escutcheon alone. No. At the age of 18, I was a member of the United States Army during World War II. We have been identified as the greatest generation, an appellation that seems a bit excessive, but even during the best of times, we have demonstrated an ability to be at our worst. Japanese Americans, innocent, uncharged with any misconduct, were rounded up primarily in California and sent to concentration camps. I've made a study of this at Stanford University, where the literature is. The title there for the whole project is the placement of Japanese Americans in concentration camps. That's the official word that was used and is used for where the folks were sent. They were sent to concentration camps solely because of their national heritage. That's why we were fighting World War II. As it turns out, we are again indebted to Earl Warren, who was the primary culprit in that outrage. He acted then out of political expedience and demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice the law and the rights of individuals for his concept of national tranquility, those character traits echoed years later, as we've seen. The suspension of the rule of law, of course, neither began nor ended with Mr. Warren. On May 1st, President Johnson issued an executive order appointing a commission to investigate the assassination of his predecessor. That was Andrew Johnson. And the murdered president was Abraham Lincoln. The Attorney General, James Speed, with the encouragement of Mr. Stanton, who had drafted the executive order in his own hand and on War Department letterhead, had ruled that the defendants were not citizens. Echo today, defendants were not citizens, although they were born here, but rather they were enemy belligerents and would therefore stand trial before a military commission. During 1866, the United States Supreme Court ruled in another matter that citizens could not be tried in military tribunals where the civilian courts were open and functioning and no military threat was apparent. However, that ruling provided very little comfort for those who had already been hanged after having been charged with the conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln. The fact that the military tribunal condemned the alleged conspirators, that tribunal was open to the press. The military tribunal, following the assassination of the president, when we were more or less still at war, because although Lee had surrendered, Davis was out there with thousands and thousands of troops in the West refusing to surrender. So the war-like atmosphere was continuing. It was a military tribunal, and it was open to the press. And the press members were seated at a table next to the witness stand. That appeared to establish a precedent that even in a warlike situation, even a military tribunal's proceedings were to be public. The Warren Commission, of course, conducted its hearings in secrecy and marked all of the testimony taken before it top secret. It also refused to publish numerous crucial documents for years. Mrs. Oswald's request to permit an attorney to represent her son's interests before the commission, of course, was denied. In fact, the defendants charged with the murder of President Lincoln and tried by the military tribunal had some rights that the deceased defendant before the Warren Commission was denied. Perhaps the presence of the press had some impact upon the military tribunal's decision to acquit some of the defendants. In addition, a vigorous defense by counsel was permitted. Among the defense lawyers was Senator Beverly Johnson of Maryland. it was a real trial. As the Warren Commission and Executive Committee acted in secrecy, permitted unlawful surveillance of its critics where there was no basis for suspecting criminal activity, permitted the detention of a non-citizen in Mexico City, all in regard to one discrete matter, a murder investigation, those almost unprecedented powers have now been adopted as standard procedure under the Patriot Act and the Homeland Security Act. Those anti-terrorism measures have granted the executive branch far-ranging powers never before generally available to any president, including the almost unchecked ability to conduct all of its operations in secret, to repress peaceful political dissent, to secure and share private and previously protected information of a personal nature, to conduct surveillance without concern for the previous legal strictures upon citizens not even reasonably suspect regarding any unlawful activity, and to detain not only non-citizens, as in the case of the Warren Commission, but citizens as well, for the purpose of conducting its investigation. The USA Patriot Act was passed with alarming speed, while members of Congress complained that they did not even have an opportunity to obtain a copy of the big bill they were voting on, much less read it. They had just been driven out of their anthrax-infested offices, didn't read the legislation, and voted on it as Ashcroft was making his now regular pronouncements of threats of incoming missiles at any moment. And in that atmosphere, this legislation was passed. There was no conference or committee report, and almost no debate at all about this legislation, which is unprecedented in terms of the destruction of our lives and our rights. Yet no legislation in our history rivals the damage done to the American people and our guests that has been accomplished by these two acts. It's too easy to report here that the inventor of the magic bullet theory, promoted to the United States Senate for his innovative work that day in Dallas, did not oppose the Patriot Act, while his colleague, Senator Russell Feingold, cast the opposition vote, stating, "Preserving our freedom is one of the main reasons that we are now engaged in this new war on terrorism. We will lose that war without firing a shot if we sacrifice the liberties of the American people." However, it would be unfair to place all of the blame and responsibility upon members of Congress for the destruction of the Constitution. When the national legislature did not respond quickly enough to President Bush's deconstruction of the Constitution, he proved he could act alone. We finally found someone acting alone here. His administration issued interim agency rules, executive orders, and policy guidelines, all of which gave his office the unbridled and unprecedented powers that it demanded. As we've seen, Dulles said, no one will care. You don't have to listen to what people think out there. Similarly, when the peoples of the world, in numbers unprecedented, 2 million people marching in London, until then, the largest number they thought was 750,000 marching in the entire history of Great Britain. 2 million people marching in London, and millions everywhere, millions in the United States. Bush said it doesn't count. Pay no attention to them. Bush said of those Americans the same thing that his predecessor said of the opposition to the Warren Commission report. It doesn't count. It doesn't mean anything what the American people want. I make those decisions. And if you questioned the draconic reach of this legislation, you have a quotation from John Ashcroft. who says, "To those who scare peace-loving people," I guess I'm among them, "with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorism." And we know what Mr. Ashcroft thinks should be done to those who only aid terrorism. On November 23rd, 1963, I called Jean Hill. I read her name in the New York Times after the assassination. And I said, I read that you were very close to the limousine when the president was shot. She said, yes. Okay. What?
We are trying to keep on schedule, but if you want, I don't want to interrupt you mid-sentence, so please.
You don't interrupt me at all. All right. I'll just speak for maybe 5 minutes, so close it. She said, have you been to Dealey Plaza? I said, I've never been to Dallas. She said, well, there's a place there. It's a grassy knoll. That's where shots came from. She said grassy knoll. I said, can I report to reporters? And I did, and it became known as the grassy knoll. And I never spoke to Jean Hill again, just that one time, until 25 years later. At a conference in Dallas, I met her in person for the first time. And I said, tell me about what happened when you were questioned. She said, I was questioned by our inspector. And she said, he was very cruel to me. He said, I could not say shots came from behind the wooden fence. He said the shots came from the book depository building, that's what I was to say. And he said he would release information about me of a defamatory nature, my personal life, unless I went along with the story that the shots came from behind the wooden fence. Now, I heard this 25 years after the event. And then she paused and she said, I guess Mr. Spector just doesn't like women named Hill. Anita Hill? You call that? All right. I knew John Kennedy. I'll be over in 2 minutes. All right. I knew John Kennedy when he was a senator candidate, and I worked with him with a group called, they named themselves the Irish Mafia, and I'm going to close on this point because this tells you something about how eyewitness testimony was altered. All right, that was Jean Hill saying that. His poor school teacher at the time had no power, but she continued to tell the truth, no matter what Spector said. Listen to this. When I was trying to get the Congress to investigate the Kennedy assassination, the biggest stumbling block was Tip O'Neill. He was the Speaker of the House, the most powerful man in the Congress. And he was saying, don't do it, the Kennedys don't want this, don't sign it. And still we were getting a number of people to agree. And that was Tip's role. Tip later retired, and he wrote a book called Man of the House. Listen to his memoirs, just a short portion of his memoirs. I was never one of those people who had doubts or suspicions about the Warren Commission's report on the president's death. But 5 years after Jack died, I was having dinner with Kenny O'Donnell, the leading member of the Irish Mafia and the strongest supporter of John Kennedy and friend, and a few other people at Jimmy's Harborside restaurant in Boston. And we got to talking about the assassination. I was surprised to hear O'Donnell say that he was sure that he had heard 2 shots that came from behind the fence. I said, this is Tip, that's not what you told the Warren Commission. I said, you're right, he replied. I told the FBI what I had heard, and they said it couldn't have happened that way, and that I must have been imagining things. So I testified the way they wanted me to. And then O'Neill continues, Dave Powers was with us at dinner that night. Powers and O'Donnell were the leaders of the group around John Kennedy, his strongest supporters, his most important advisors other than Bobby, and his closest friends. Dave Powers was with us at dinner that night, and his recollection of the shots was the same as O'Donnell's. And so there will always be some skepticism in my mind about the cause of Jack's death. I used to think that the only people who doubted the conclusions of the Warren Commission were crackpots. Now, however, I'm not so sure. 2 of the most powerful political men in America committed perjury before the Warren Commission because the FBI told them to, and it was about where shots came that had killed their president and their beloved friend. They lied about that. But, I'll be finished in 1 second now. But while the influential men who loved him refused to tell the truth, think of Gene Hill, S.M. Holland, Lee Bowers, and the many others of no power who went through the same process that the Powers and O'Donnell did and said, I saw the president die, he's my president, I will never lie about that. If you get nothing else out of this conference, and maybe 40 years later all the details are of less importance than one fact, have the courage to speak truth to power. That is the only way this country can thrive and survive. And besides that, it's the only worthwhile thing ever to do with your life. And besides that, it's the most fun. Thank you.